Recording started.
Welcome to Preparing Grant Proposals, part of the 2012 Community Leadership Institute. Grant funding can be an excellent source of support for your organization. Local, state, and federal government, as well as foundations, and a variety of companies make grants. For new organizations, grants are a way to jumpstart your mission. Think of them as venture capital for doing good. A grant can sustain you until other types of support are in place. For established organizations, grants are a way to fund new programs or expand the capacity of existing ones. They can also supplement your budget by supplying program funding and taking the pressure off of administrative costs. To be successful in securing grant funding, you need to understand the proposal process and pay attention to detail. The volume of proposals submitted to most grant makers far exceeds the available funding, so the review process is intended to weed out those proposals that are least likely to further the giving objectives of the funder. So to this end, small mistakes can cost you during the scoring process. So attention to detail is critical. Not only is it important to pay attention to detail, it's also important to write in a style that sets your organization apart from the rest of the proposals. In order to do this, you need to write in a conversational style. Don't make it too informal, but pay attention to not include too much institutional jargon. Don't assume that the person scoring your proposal understands the acronyms you use daily at your office. So what is a grant? Foundations, companies, and government agencies in the response to community needs give out grants. Grants are awards of money used to further the combined missions of the funder and the grantee. The process usually follows a request for proposals, a review process, and the award. Grantees are usually required to submit an evaluation of the effectiveness of the program for which they receive funds. Foundations are required to give a specific percentage of their assets away each year. So comparing the types of grants, we have government, corporations, and foundations. Foundations exist in many forms, from community foundations to individual family ones. They usually have specific areas of interest that they fund, and their proposals tend to be less rigid and complex than government foundations. Companies often give grants to set up their own foundations. They typically fund projects that complement their business model. For example, a professional football team may give to youth sports, for example. They also tend to give geographically in places where they have stores, factories, or offices. Government grants come from federal, state, and local entities. Often a department of the state government will administer a federal grant program. Government grants tend to have longer forms to complete and require more documentation. In addition, they typically have more evaluation requirements both during and after the grant period is completed. So that's something to keep in mind when deciding to go for a federal grant. Now, before you apply, we want to make sure, have we read the guidelines? Does the funder's priorities and our mission align? Do we meet the criteria for funding? And how are we going to sustain the program after the grant period is over? Begin by reading the complete grant-seeking guide, typically for foundations, or the funding announcement for government agencies. Both organizations include these on their websites. If you can't find the guidelines online, call the funder and ask them to send you a copy. Next, determine if the organization's funding priorities and guidelines match your mission and project. Do you meet their guidelines for eligibility? Don't try to submit to a foundation in the hopes that you can convince them to change their funding priorities. If they don't fund youth programs and you're an after-school mentoring agency, move on to the next foundation. Next, you want to determine if your agency has the ability to meet their requirements should you be funded. For example, do they require some type of matching funds? In other words, are you going to have to raise money to match what they've given you? Are there costs that they don't cover, such as salaries or computers? At this point, it's also a good idea to include all of the relevant stakeholders in the process. Questions your team should be asking: are we looking to create a new program or expand an existing one? Who will be responsible for implementing and evaluating the program? What are the goals and objectives of the program? Do those goals and objectives truly meet a community need or just an institutional want? Who are the potential community partners for this project? And what additional funds still need to be raised? So let's look at the life cycle of the grant process. First, we have the letter of intent, the RFP or the request for proposal, the grant award, and then the evaluation process. So we're going to look at these various stages and kind of break them down more in depth. Now, we want you to keep in mind too that this is a guide to the most common components of grant proposal. A particular funder may have a different set of requirements. They may change it up a little bit. So always make sure that you read through their instructions quite carefully. But what we're going to give you are the most common things that folks will typically ask for. So let's look at the letter of intent. Often foundations and corporations will require a letter of intent or an LOI in advance of the full proposal. The LOI is usually due 2 to 3 months before the full proposal is due. Many organizations will not accept a full proposal without the LOI, no matter how strong your case for support is. So be sure to pay attention to the organization's deadlines. The LOI is beneficial to both parties. For the foundation, it allows them to weed out any projects that don't fit their funding objectives or their geographic focus. For organization, the process can save you time and resources of creating a full proposal if your organization isn't a good fit for the funder. Now, the RFP process we want to take a look at next. And this has several components, and we'll break each one of them down for you. First is the cover letter. Next will be the case for support. We'll have an introduction, objectives and goals, methods, evaluation, and budget. So after the funder has approved your ROI, they will invite you to submit a full proposal. And these are often referred to as the RFP or the request for proposal. Make sure you take note of any deadlines, supporting document requirements, and other special instructions that they require. If you're submitting your RFP by mail, you need to include a cover letter, usually signed by the chairperson of your board or your CEO. Sometimes they ask for both. The cover letter should remind the funder of the program you are proposing and the impact that it will have on your community. It can also include any partnerships or any community support for your project. As more funders post their RFPs on their websites to be completed online, fewer of them are requiring this step than in the past. Next, we come to the narrative. Most proposals will begin with some form of introductory request from the organization. This is the place to describe your organization, describe your project, and spell out the cost. This will be much more specific than the information you gave in the cover letter. It's very critical to craft this portion carefully because it might be the one place you have to separate yourself from the other organizations competing for grant funding. To make your proposal stand out, be mindful of wording and voice. Use active verbs instead of passive ones. Avoid jargon that might confuse the reader. Don't overuse this technique, but sprinkle in some questions that cause the reader to pause and consider their own experiences as they relate to the problem you are trying to solve. Remember that you are telling a story. Keeping your reader requires creating the sense that they are part of the narrative. Describe your brand and your expertise. Give a brief history of your organization and describe what separates your organization from the others in your service area. List relevant accomplishments and describe those projects that you have completed that relate to the proposal that's being submitted. Some funders may ask for letters of support to be attached as well, and these are often referred to as memorandums of understanding that you might have with organizations. Even if you don't have these types of documents, it's a great idea to mention any relevant partnerships in this section. Next, we want to build on your case for support. In doing this, we need to clearly define the problem. Keep in mind that we should never refer to the problem in terms of needs of the organization. This may come as a shock to most organizations, but you don't need money. The community, your clients, they have the need. Unmet needs, lack of resources, lack of access, etc. You're merely asking for the resources to help meet that need. So the question that we want to answer in this part of the proposal is, what external need is our organization best suited to address? So to give your case more weight, you'll want to include statistics and cite your sources. Use them to demonstrate the need in your area of service as opposed to quoting some national trend. Don't make the mistake of assuming that the reader knows how serious the problem is in your community. Finally, you want to tie them back to your organization's expertise and past experience. So you've defined the problem, now you want to define why you're the best one to address that problem. And as you define the problem, build a framework that helps you tell the story of how your organization can address the problem in a way that's measurable, attainable, and sustainable. Measurable means that we can measure outcomes in such a way to demonstrate the positive impact we have made on our community. So for example, we might say that as a result of our project, we want to see a 40% increase in the number of women who remain housed for a year after leaving our homeless shelter. Attainable means that we have thought carefully about the way we want to accomplish, and we have made a case that a funder would find reasonable. This is where we demonstrate our organization's ability and history in working with these particular issues. And then finally, sustainable. A sustainable solution refers to budget matters. Does our budget make sense, and are the costs and projections reasonable? Do we have a plan in place for future funding? A common mistake you want to avoid is to define the method as a problem. For example, I might say that a problem is that we need to build 10 new cabins at our music camp because we have a waiting list. Building cabins is a method. Instead, we could say that a community needs study has determined that there are no opportunities this summer, other than our camp, for low-income children to learn music. The study also cites university and federal studies that conclude that exposure to music lessons at an early age has measurably positive impact on school attendance, graduation, and juvenile crime. Since the study has been released, we have had a waiting list for our program, but can't meet the demand. Now we've described it as a need as opposed to describing a method. So next we want to take a look at objectives and goals, and this is where a lot of your scoring comes in when you're dealing with a foundation. This can be the make or break section. So we want to define the results that we expect to achieve and demonstrate the benefits of each objective. Writing strong goals and objectives is a critical part of the grant-seeking process and the implementation process. So in other words, it's going to be much easier for you to carry out and evaluate your program if you've created strong objectives and goals in the first place when you're doing the grant proposal process. So in the context of grant writing, goals and objectives can easily be confused or reversed if we're not careful in composing this portion of the RFP. Goals are measurable, broad statements that define the vision and direction of the program. So our goal may be to reduce the return rate of women who have left our homeless shelter. Objectives, on the other hand, are specific, measurable, and have an expiration date. So an example would be, at the conclusion of the grant period, 80% of the women who have left our homeless shelter and have taken part in our continuing care program will remain housed for 1 year. You see the difference? The goal, broad, immeasurable. The objective, specific, and measurable. And as we mentioned with defining the problem, be careful not to let method creep into your objective statement. For example, our objective is to provide emergency financial assistance to people with verified incomes below the poverty level. Now that sounds very specific, but it's really a method. Providing the financial assistance in this example is a method, not an outcome. So some quick rules of thumb that will help you write better objectives and help organize your thoughts when planning your program. And we want to think about the ABCDs of objectives. A, audience, who's the target population. B, behavior, what behavior do we want to change. C is circumstances, what circumstances will create and desire the change in behavior. And then D, degree, what degree of change do we expect from the change in behavior. And another great way to think about this is SMART, S-M-A-R-T, specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and time-oriented. So now let's look at methods. So after we've created our goals and objectives, we'll be asked to describe the methods that we will use to achieve them. Organize your methods to follow the timeline of the grant period and list the tasks that are needed to complete the project. Keep in mind that RFP instructions may limit the number of words you can use in this section, so don't list all the minor details, just hit the big stuff. Your timeline should tell the person scoring your grant that your organization has a well thought out plan. That's the main objective that we're trying to achieve here. Also, depending on the RFP, you may be asked to list staff and volunteers who will be assigned to the project and what material resources will be needed. You will also be asked to define the target audience. You will also be asked how they will be targeted or recruited and how you will follow up for the evaluation. Be prepared to discuss your data collection methods and which organizations you will partner with, if any, on this project. You will also be asked to list specific outcomes that you expect to achieve based on your objectives. Keep in mind that funding sources will expect certain outcomes based on their funding priorities. So this is another reason to carefully read the application and the grant maker's funding objectives so that your outcomes meet the types of outcomes that they're looking for with their philanthropic priorities. Keep in mind that funders will weight this section of the RFP with the highest point value typically. So describe your activities in detail and explain why those particular methods are justified and realistic. Although grant awards don't need to be paid back, there is an expectation of accountability and good stewardship that comes with accepting the gift. So most organizations require a report at the end of the grant term that documents the outcomes and results. All government grant funding and most foundation grants require some form of evaluation. Government grants tend to have the most stringent reporting guidelines, so be prepared for monthly reports. The evaluation requirements for accepting a gift can sometimes be arduous, so make sure that you've calculated staff time and resources into your program plan. For example, a chapter of a large organization received a small local grant for $1,000. The terms of that grant necessitated that one of their paid staff go to monthly meetings, and because this wasn't anywhere near the large organization headquarters, they wound up spending more money in travel, in employee time, than the money that they got in the grant. So keep those kinds of things in mind. What are we going to have to do for the evaluation, and is the grant request worth the amount of time that we're going to have to do? So in developing your evaluation methods, remember that you're trying to answer the question of how success will be determined. So what will be different in your community after the project is completed? You will also need to decide if evaluation needs to be done internally or from an outside third party. And there are several metrics that can be used to evaluate a program. One thing to keep in mind is that data is only relevant if it has the power of language. So in order to do so, your data should help you tell a story. The narrative of that story should describe the execution, the impact, and the future of your project. As much as for the funder as for your organization, you want to answer these questions with your evaluation. Did we accomplish our objectives? If not, what did we learn that will make us more likely to succeed in the future? Are we the right organization to tackle this problem? Were the resources sufficient to carry out the program? What other resources would make us more successful? What impact do we have on our community staff and volunteers? And can we sustain or replicate this program? Now let's talk about budget. Grant seekers can sometimes become intimidated by the budget process, but it doesn't have to be something that keeps you up at night. Most funders now include a budget form that you simply have to input numbers into. In this case, it's simply a matter of plugging in the numbers that they've requested, so be sure to pay attention to which costs the funders will allow and which ones they forbid. And you can always refer back to the RFP instructions for that. If the funder does not provide a budget form, then you will need to generate something of your own. Some funders will ask for a program budget and an organizational budget. The program budget refers only to those expenses and revenues associated with the project you are proposing. The organization budget is your entire agency's budget for the year. And some of the typical things that a budget is going to include: salaries, travel, equipment, supplies, printing, contracted services, administrative costs. Then you can refer to the study guide for a more complete list. So some tips that we want to leave you with. Some of these we've mentioned, and we just kind of want to reinforce those. Read the RFP carefully and then follow the instructions. We can't stress that enough. Again, avoid jargon. I personally have been a grant reader for various programs, and I can tell you a lot of times there are people in the room who are just not experts on whatever particular proposal that they're reading. So I know that may sound like a surprise, but that really does happen. So avoid jargon. Always, it's a great idea to let someone read your proposal who has nothing to do with your organization, because if they understand it, then chances are the person scoring the grants will. Don't declare things, explain them. Have someone outside your organization read the proposal, as I've just mentioned, and be concise. A lot of times these folks are reading 20, 30 proposals in a scoring day, so be concise, but definitely write in a conversational style. The grant-seeking process gives you the opportunity to share your mission with a foundation, company, or government agency whose mission and objectives align with yours. It provides the forum for you to ask a funder to give through your organization, not to your organization, in order to affect positive change in your community. So write with confidence and don't use a tone that seems like begging. Funders want to spend their social currency wisely. Give them an opportunity to spend it well with your organization by crafting a well-organized and easy-to-understand proposal following the guidelines we shared in this course. Again, if you have any questions, you can email me at jeffstanger@causegeek.com. Thank you very much.